and make it work.
You know, for almost 150 years, this building has stood in the heart of Glasgow. And for all of those years, think of the thousands of people that came here to work and produce and to learn. And all that are left now are the ghosts and the whispers of bygone days and a pile of rubble. But if this building is ever lost to Glasgow, it would be a shame. This is a vital part of the industrial architectural heritage of this city. But thankfully, there are a small group of hard-working people determined to keep Thomson's legacy alive.
In 1861, Thomson moved his family to Moray Place, a beautiful Greek-inspired terrace on Glasgow's south side that he designed himself.
Hello, David.
Hello, Andrew.
I'm meeting Andrew Gregg, who lives at number 1, to find out how he's been restoring the architect's former home.
So, this is another Greek Thomson butte. So how was it when you moved in?
All covered in paint. When you think there's 150 years of other varnishes and paint and different fashions of interior decoration and layers of wallpaper. So one of the first things I was interested in finding out is whether there were any remains of the original decoration, because we know this was Thomson's own house, so it was very interesting to find out whether there was anything left from his time.
What did you uncover?
So we started to peel the wallpaper off and found these friezes and the original paintwork, the original colours. So almost everything you see now is as it was in Alexander Thomson's time.
And is this ironwork original, Andrew?
Yes, it is. It was all painted white again, and we had some poor man had to come and strip it with chemicals and then by hand. And he said it was one of the worst jobs of his life.
But it was worth it, because it's...
It was well worth it. You
Yeah.
can see the detail, and they're beautiful now.
Oh, and that beautiful door through there, Andrew.
Yes, well, another example in the dining room of Thomson's beautiful woodwork, and he chose the wood very carefully to be free of knots and to have nice grain and a natural colour, which is what he really was important to him in his houses.
Now, you've uncovered a little patch on the wall there. What's that?
Well, above there's a tiny bit of the original decoration of the dining room. So I did get a professional painting restorer to uncover that little fragment that was very expensive, but it shows at least the original colour scheme of this room.
But it does give you a lovely idea of what it was like when Thomson and his family all lived here.
It clearly wasn't a show home. It wasn't somewhere where he was showing off richness of decoration. It's an ordinary middle-class house.
Number 1 Moray Place is different from so many of Thomson's buildings. It's surprisingly modest, restrained. And for me, it's especially moving that it's being so lovingly restored, because this is where Thomson ended his days. In the winter of 1874-75, the asthma that had plagued Thomson all his life grew steadily worse. He had made vague plans to visit Italy to try to improve his health, but realised now that he'd left it too late. He was never to make that foreign trip. On the 22nd of March 1875, Alexander Thomson died here in his home in Moray Place. He was 57 years old. Thomson left behind an astonishing collection of buildings. Unique one-offs, which challenged the conventions of so much Victorian architecture. But he also left behind intriguing plans and sketches for buildings he never got to realise.
Fiona, I believe this is one of Thomson's last drawings, am I right?
Yes, he was working on this drawing something like 2 days before his death. In fact, his biographer, Thomas Gildard, rather dramatically referred to him having been working on this when the pencil fell from his hand.
How dramatic, but what a way
Very
to go.
dramatic.
Yes. And what was it for? Where was it for?
The thinking is that it was a competition entry for Annan Town Hall.
Oh, wow, what's this?
Oh, this is lovely.
Isn't it?
I think the thinking is that this is a combined church and manse at Balfron.
Where he came from.
Where he was born. And he was, of course, a devout Presbyterian. He was devoutly religious, very moral, very spiritual. And this is a kind of an example of his continuing commitment to the church. This is lovely.
Oh.
This is an absolutely remarkable unbuilt
Yes, but you could
project by
imagine
him.
coming across it, riding through the deserts of North Africa, and suddenly the heat haze in the distance, this extraordinary, beautiful, captivating building appears like a
yeah.
mirage before you. So this was his proposed design for the Albert Memorial in London, wasn't it?
That's the conclusion that's been drawn. It's far more sizable than the final Gothic shrine to the Prince Consort that was designed by George Gilbert Scott, who of course ultimately secured the commission.
Tell me, Thomson suffered from being from the provinces, didn't he? He was slightly looked down upon.
I think so, in addition to which he railed against the Gothic style, which was the popular style of the period, particularly in England. And I think that made him deeply unfashionable.
Glasgow University on Gilmore Hill, rising high over the city skyline that represents the triumph of the Gothic over the Greek. It was built by that most fashionable of London architects, George Gilbert Scott, and Thomson hated it. He said its mock medievalism made it a laughingstock. But who was listening? By the time the university was completed, Thomson was dead, and it seemed as if his vision was dead too. He had a few disciples, but the truth was that Gothic and not Greek was the fashion. And for the next few decades, medievalism would rule. But perhaps, just perhaps, it might be Thomson's vision that ultimately endured. A generation after Thomson, a group of international architects, including Frank Lloyd Wright in America, Mies van der Rohe in Germany, and Le Corbusier in France, began to think about new ways of designing and building that chimed with his elemental philosophy.
I think Thomson recognized the emergence of what I would call a modern architecture. Not modernism, because I hate that word, but a modern architecture. Free thinking, using classical principles, but not being a slave to the aesthetics. And he's using and adapting the language, the architectural language of his day. That's the magic of the man. That's why I admire him.
There is an argument that Thomson anticipated certain aspects of 20th century architecture. He was aware that his own time hadn't produced an identifiable style. You find him saying, cast away archaeology and let's not be dependent on the past. So he created his own extraordinary style of architecture, rooted in the past, but yet something new.
There's one last Thomson building I want to visit. A building which I think perfectly represents that radical fusion of the old and the new.
At first sight, this looks like a big detached villa. It has Thomson stamp all over it, the shallow pitched roof, geometric carvings, and of course, not an arch in sight. But come with me for a second. It's a mirror image of the other side. But this is in fact a suburban semi-detached. Now what Thomson did brilliantly was to give each house its own separate entrance, with the back of each home looking like an organic part of the other.
It is not an optical illusion, it's magic.
David.
Evelyn,
Welcome.
hello. Lovely to meet you, and thank you
That's
for
great.
agreeing to show me around.
Dr. Evelyn Silber owns one half of this inspired building in Langside, and she's kindly offered to show me around.
Lead on.
Right, come on through.
Oh.
Well,
Wow. The interiors are just as beautiful and extraordinary as the exteriors.
yep, he really liked doing his decoration and echoing some of the things that are outside inside as well.
So even for you, what is so special about this house?
Well, I fell for it the first time I walked through the door. The scale of the rooms is just wonderful, and the sense of craftsmanship and the colour and the way all those things interact. You're always aware when you wake up in the morning, you're living this really beautiful building, and every time you walk into a room, it strikes you anew just how lovely it is.
You've whetted my appetite. You're going to show me the rest of the house?
Yes, let's go upstairs. So here we are.
Oh, beautiful. This is quite breathtaking. Stunning. This is your living room.
Yeah.
Look at the windows.
It is amazing, isn't it? 180 degrees, windows right the way round. And that, in a way, it makes me think of his sort of proto-modernity, because, you know, a modern house, a lot of people would want in their reception rooms an enormous amount of light. And yet here he is in 1855-56, doing the same thing with a whole full length of the wall.
He was a genius
and
ahead of his time,
yeah,
wasn't he? He
yeah.
was a true visionary.
Absolutely.
Alexander Greek Thomson's nickname was a misnomer. He was equally Egyptian Thomson, Assyrian Thomson, Indian Thomson, definitely modern Thomson. In fact, he was hard to put in a box, impossible to pin down and categorize. But his work anticipated much of the architecture that surrounds us today. And this inspirational, intensely creative and original man left behind another, more personal legacy. A few years after Thomson's death, his friends met to discuss how best to celebrate his achievements. As a tribute to a man who had never been abroad, they decided to set up a travel scholarship for young artists and architects. And one of the first to win that award was a rising young star from the East End of Glasgow, Charles Rennie Mackintosh. Thomson and Mackintosh, two great international architects from a great international city that has never embraced or supported its native genius.
He's hugely important nationally and internationally. I think Thomson ranks amongst the greatest.
He's a towering figure. Great mind as well as being a highly original architect. I put him top.
He was a profound thinker, a great dreamer. He had this remarkable capacity for looking beyond the earthly, the worldly. You've got to acknowledge that you know, he's one of the greats.
Next tonight here on BBC Two Scotland, stand-up comedy introduced by Joe Lycett live at the Apollo, and then a man who made his name doing stand-up comedy in one of his most acclaimed film roles. Robin Williams stars in Dead Poets Society at 11:45.